Welcome to our event today. My name is Jessica Main, and I'm a faculty member at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Asian Studies. I teach courses on Buddhism and specialize in modern Japanese Buddhism and social ethics. I have the privilege to direct the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society, and I join you today from my home office. For those listening or reading the captions, I am middle-aged, white, and woman presenting. The Asian Center, where our home Department of Asian Studies is physically located, appears in the background behind me with a tree in blossom in the foreground. Hopefully spring is truly around the corner. I acknowledge that the place where I live and work, where the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation program is physically located, is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, who are currently engaged in struggles over sovereignty over this land. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. We gather tonight virtually from many places to do the same and learn from one another. Through the generous support of the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, our program enables undergraduate teaching about Buddhism and brings in a variety of scholars to speak to our UBC community, faculty, staff, students, and members of the community, and in the case of virtual events, global attendees. Tonight's lecture is the first of two in our Tung Ling Kok Yuen Canada Foundation Distinguished Speaker Series. We are delighted for tonight's lecture to have partnered with UBC's Himalayan program to welcome Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo to give this virtual lecture. And her talk, as mentioned, is entitled Precarity. I first encountered Professor Tsomo's work as a graduate student at McGill University. I was fascinated with Buddhist ethics, and I found the differences between the rules for monks and the rules for nuns to be a topic that I continued to return to. I just couldn't put it down. I wondered how best to understand the fact that across Buddhist traditions, the rules for nuns are both more numerous and more onerous than those for monks, and that the nuns' lineage died out in many places in Asia. I still wonder about how best to understand this, but at the time, I found Professor Tsomo's work, Sisters in Solitude, Two Traditions of Buddhist Monastic Ethics for Women, published in 1996 from SUNY Press, helped me to see the issues at play, both those ethical and historical. Her work also helped me realize that academic study of something can be deeply personally meaningful. And in fact, the academic study of something can be part of that meaning itself. Professor Tsomo's study is part of her journey to become a fully ordained nun in the Tibetan tradition, which meant reviving the lineage from China or Korea, where the lineage of nuns had survived, and to bring it back to the Tibetan tradition, and all of the work that that difficult task required. Since that time, she has pursued the scholarly, religious, and personal paths simultaneously, with a series of edited volumes on Buddhist women and nuns throughout the Buddhist world, and a recent monograph on the same, Women in Buddhist Traditions, published in 2020 from NYU Press. At the same time, she has worked to revive the full ordination for Buddhist women and is a founding member of Sakyadhita International Association of Buddhist Women, launched in 1987 at Bodh Gaya, and is still very active today with many regional branches. She is currently a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego, and her research interests include women, death and dying, Buddhist feminist ethics, Buddhism and bioethics, religion and politics, a personal favorite, Buddhism, social ethics, and Buddhist transnationalism. In her talk on precarity, living and dying in the Himalayan Buddhist cultures, she tells us that Buddhists have a lot of wisdom to share about dying. In Himalayan Buddhist cultures in particular, the precarity of life in an unpredictable climate and and fragile ecology give rise to a large body of knowledge about the practice of dying. Meditation on the stages of the dying process simulates the dissolution of the elements of body and mind and prepares a person to transition from this life to the next life with confidence and moment-to-moment awareness. A few housekeeping things before I turn the virtual floor over to our speaker. First, please note that although we are recording, all attendees' information is anonymized or excluded. And in fact, you have the ability as an attendee to ask any questions you would like anonymously. So please do select that option if you prefer to remain private. If you have a question for our speaker, please do ask it using the Q&A function, the button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a technical concern, you can use the chat to talk to myself, our program assistants here tonight, and we can perhaps help with any technical troubles that you're having. We also use the chat to post links or other information. For example, we know that we have many talks upcoming. Willie, could you paste the information about our upcoming talks into the chat window, please? Wonderful. And myself and Dagmar Schwerk, who is here representing the UBC Himalayan program and is a Kensei Foundation postdoctoral fellow here at UBC. She will be helping me field your questions and ask these of our speaker tonight. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Tsomo to take over. She's planned to speak for around 50 minutes and has lots of beautiful photos. Please know at any time, if a question pops into your mind, please ask it using the Q&A function and we'll gather them together for a Q&A session following the talk. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Tashidele and aloha. Very sorry for the technological glitches. I'm here on the North Shore of Oahu, and I'd like to acknowledge the Hawaiian land and culture for which we are very grateful. We all benefit from. So this evening, we want to talk about the delicate topic of death and dying and see what we can learn from Himalayan cultures. This topic is very dear to my heart because I always had this question of what happens to us after we die since I was a young child. And I didn't get any really clear answers until I arrived in Dharamsala in 1972 and saw Geshe Ngamang Targe explaining, and at the second stage after death, you will see a faint smoke. And I thought, oh, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And so I sat at his feet for 6 years and learned all that I could. Came in very handy when I got bitten by a snake in 1989 and faced death up close and personal myself. It wasn't my first encounter and it wasn't my last, but it was a powerful experience. So now what I'd like to share with you is my experience with the Himalayan tradition. And of course, we'll start from Tibet, but some anecdotes. I remember one time I had hepatitis for the third or fourth time, and I went to the Tibetan doctor, Yeshe Dindan, in Dharamsala, and he took my pulse and so forth and was reading the pulse. And then I said, oh, well, doctor, am I going to die? And he said, well, of course you're going to die. We're all going to die. And he cracked up. It was hilarious. I mean, hilarious in a way. So the topic of death and dying is really upfront and center for the Buddhist traditions in general, because it has been a topic for contemplation from the very beginning of Buddhist history. And it has also been a powerful topic of meditation that the Buddha recommended for people to practice meditation on corpses in cemeteries, in cremation grounds. So I'm trying to find my PowerPoint, which is eluding me. Okay, here we go. Which I'll show you some images in a moment. The Tibetans are very clear about the importance of meditation on death and impermanence. And they say if you don't meditate on death in the morning, you waste the day. If you don't meditate on death in the evening, you waste the night. So the topic is really powerful and important. Of course, the way that we die will, to some extent, mirror the way that we have lived. So there's not such a vast distinction between how to live well and how to die well. In fact, the practices and way of life, the ethics, compassion, loving kindness, all of these principles that we try to live by will be the same principles that will help to guide our dying. In the Tibetan, and this could be this fascination with the topic of death in the Tibetan tradition in particular. Mind you, it's in all of the Buddhist traditions from the beginning, from the time of the Buddha, but especially in Tibet. And this is why I've named the presentation Precarity, because Tibet was a very precarious environment ecologically. There were ferocious storms. The temperatures reached to way below zero. And I remember even living in Dharamsala for 15 years in a mud hut. Sometimes people would come by the next day to see whether my mud hut was still standing, because the storms were so powerful. And yes, indeed, often the roof did blow off. But this is the kind of precarious situation. Of course, all of the modern conveniences, medical science and so forth, weren't available at that time, though Tibetan medical system is very powerful. It probably saved my life at the time of the snake bite, because normally people who are bitten by a viper do not survive. And I survived very well. It's a reconstructed arm. But another theory is that perhaps the Tibetans were especially concerned about the topic of death because the pre-Buddhist tradition in Tibet, the Bön tradition, was very much interested in the topic of death. They had a theory of something like 24 souls, and they were, always inquiring into this topic. And so it fit well with the Buddhist texts that started to pour in from the 8th to 10th centuries. Now, in any case, in Tibetan cultures, and we have to talk about multiple Tibetan cultures because Tibetan Buddhist sphere of influence is very vast, it's very wide, reaching all the way down to South India and all the way up to Russia, Buryatia, and all the way over to Europe with Kalmykia, right? In these traditions, when a person reaches the end of life, it is important to assure that the surrounding environment is as peaceful and calm as possible. Hopefully, sometimes they'll place a Buddha image in view to allow the person to come to terms with their own experience of impending death. They say it's very important not to disturb the body. Many people will give away all of their possessions before they die, so there'll be no lingering attachments. The family will generally summon a religious specialist to verify that the person's consciousness has left the body before arranging to move or dispose of the body. So we see that the state of consciousness is most important. The state of the body, once the consciousness has left, is, can we say, immaterial in a way. It doesn't really matter what you do with the body after the consciousness has left. Until it is certain that the consciousness has left the body, it's advisable to allow the deceased to remain undisturbed for as long as possible, at least a few days. So normally they would consult a lama, a qualified lama, one who specializes or is said to have a special ability to determine when the consciousness has left the body before they arrange for cremation or other bodily disposal. And that means that the family should not cry, they should not fight over the estate or something like that, but just let the person go through their process. It's believed that during this time, the consciousness of the dying person is traversing an intermediate state. An intermediate state, or a bardo, between life and death. Now, there's a theory of 7 different bardos, maybe 9 different bardos, but the one that we're particularly concerned with here is the bardo, or the intermediate period between the last moment of this life and the first moment of whatever comes afterwards. And ideally, the deceased will be fully aware during this process. And this highlights the importance of meditation practice. The calmer state we can maintain during the process of dying, the better. To try to refrain from fear and anger and other disturbing emotions. Ordinarily, a lama will be consulted to determine the time to cremate the body, as I said, usually by performing a divination known as a mo. Okay, so a qualified lama will do a divination that reveals a fortunate date and time for performing the death rituals. Now, for ordinary people, this would be 2 or 3 days, perhaps. In the case of a very sudden death, such as an accident, it's said that the consciousness exits immediately. There will not be an intermediate state. In the case of a highly realized practitioner, this intermediate state may continue for up to 49 days, according to tradition. And there are cases where it has continued beyond 49 days. I'll talk something about that later. Until that time, then, they will assemble monks who will say prayers and chant on behalf of the dying person or the recently deceased. And these prayers and chants are said to create merit, to ensure a fortunate rebirth. So if a poor person has practiced well, as I said, it may even be possible for someone to achieve liberation during the bardo, during the intermediate state. So whether rich or poor, Tibetan Buddhist families invariably invite monks to chant prayers on behalf of the deceased, and usually it would be monks from a monastery with which they have close connections. The length of the funeral rites varies according to the season. For example, in the winter, these funerary rituals may continue for 15 days before the body is cremated, or even 49 days in the case of an accomplished religious practitioner. During the summer months, the rituals may only last for a few days because the body is likely to decompose more quickly in the heat. Now, some may ask, how do we know when the consciousness has left the body? And this is the distinguishing factor. Once the body begins to decompose, we know that the consciousness has left the body. Until that time, we may assume that the consciousness is still in or around the body. And interesting to note that many European countries and some states in the United States allow for a body to rest in state up to 3 days. Interesting, yeah? So the family invites the monks who are chanting all day, from morning to night, chanting Buddhist texts, prayers, and mantras, and stopping only for meals and tea. Lots of tea, right? The monks are treated with deference and respect and thought to play a very valuable role in ensuring a favorable rebirth for the deceased. Now, sometimes there'll be a reading of a text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's not the real title. The real title is Liberation to Hearing in the Intermediate State. And some families will call a practitioner, a lama, to read this book at the bedside of the dying person to provide guidance through the stages of the dying process and the after-death state. If the dying person has thoroughly practiced meditation on these stages and is able to maintain focused awareness on the visions that arise at each stage, this will allay fears and anxieties that are likely to arise in the dying process. An accomplished practitioner will recognize each stage of the dying process clearly, including the external signs and the internal visions that accompany each stage as the elements of the body dissolve or disintegrate. And I'll show you in detail about these stages as we go along. Eventually, the practitioner will be faced with what they call the clear light of death. And someone who has practiced well and studied well will recognize this as the clear light of death that appears to the mind's eye and will be recognized by the practitioner for what it is, the true empty nature of the mind itself. So an unpracticed person, when dying and faced by this powerful, blinding white light, might just swoon and pass out. But a person who has practiced and studied well will recognize it as the clear light of death and the true nature of the mind itself, which is empty of true existence by nature. Some advanced practitioners are able to remain in a state of meditation for extended periods. Some even beyond 49 days after the vital signs have ceased, without any signs of distraction or bodily decomposition, signaling that the practitioner's consciousness is still present. We have a case in Bhutan where a monk has been in meditation. The vital signs stopped more than 12 years ago, and he is still sitting in meditation. No breath, no heartbeat, but no decomposition of the body either. And there are a number of cases such as this. Now, eventually, when the head tilts forward and a white drop appears from one nostril, this is taken as a sign that the consciousness has left the body and the person has died. Stories about such accomplished practitioners circulate widely up to the present time in Bhutan, India, Mongolia, Russia, and Tibet. The Buddhist practitioners prepare for death in a number of ways. For one, they contemplate death as a means to realize that death is inevitable, which in turn generates an awareness of the preciousness of human life. So although it may sound depressing to reflect on death and dying, in fact, it wakes us up to the preciousness of each present moment of our life. So quite the contrary to expectations, right? It's counterintuitive. But by meditating on death, we learn to appreciate life much more fully. No living creature can avoid death, and the time of death is unknowable. Yama is the archetypal lord of death, probably preceded Buddhism, but it's been in Indian culture for a very long time. And the Lord of Death is said poised to pounce on his victims at any moment. So we may have an expected lifetime due to our actions in past lives, but nothing is certain. In fact, death can come at any time. So the best preparation for a peaceful death is to live an ethical life, engaging energetically in wholesome actions that lead to liberation. This can include meditation, study, circumambulation, many different kinds of practices, generosity, and so on. Preparing one's mind for the moment of death is especially important because the last moment of this lifetime is the proximate cause of the next moment, which will be the first moment of whatever comes after. That is the first moment of one's next existence, whatever that may be, right? So if we have not trained in maintaining a calm mind and steady mind during our lifetime, we're likely to become agitated at the moment of death, afraid or angry at the last moment, and die in a troubled state of mind. After all, we're leaving behind everything we hold dear, our possessions, our families, our friends, even our very identity. And this, if we die in such a troubled state of mind, that will adversely affect the nature of our next rebirth. In Himalayan Buddhist communities where there is sufficient firewood, cremation of the dead is common. It's the norm. But in areas of Tibet where there is little or no firewood and the ground is frozen solid, Buddhists may practice what is known as sky burial, offering the physical remains of the dead to the birds and wild animals as a last act of generosity. Since from a Buddhist perspective, once a person's consciousness has left the body, the corpse may be dispatched in whatever way is most convenient. Sky burial is considered a practical and very meaningful way of meeting an existential need. So now this raises many questions, I'm sure, in people's minds, but I'd like to go from here to the PowerPoint, I hope, and give you some images of the places and experiences that we're discussing. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and here. Okay, so now I have many slides, so I'm going to go rather quickly through these in the interest of time, which is, okay. So here is a conventional map of Tibet, which is not even named because it's been absorbed into the People's Republic of China. And yet here is traditional Tibet, the various regions of Tibet as Tibetans know it. This is a map that was created by Professor Tsering Shakya, which shows that in the uprisings of 2008, people were very surprised to see that the uprisings, 150 uprisings in 150 different locations where people risked their lives to protest the oppression of Chinese rule. It was spread throughout Tibet, not simply in central Tibet, as many people have been led to believe. I've been to Tibet 3 times, starting in 1982. I don't wear Tibetan robes there because, well, it's inconvenient, as they say. The government doesn't like it. So I wear Chinese robes when I travel to Tibet. Here I am in Amdo, at Kumbum Monastery. Now, Tibet, as you probably know, is a unique culture with its own language, its own extensive literature. Printing presses still operating today with wood wrought prints. Its distinctive architecture. Its own distinctive legends and material culture, such as the prayer wheels and the ritual instruments. An ancient system of philosophical debate, which was preserved only in Tibet. And this tradition continues up till the present day. It's fascinating. And the Tibetans were so into it that they would even debate through the winter months, dig a hole in the ground to keep warm and just keep debating, even in sub-zero temperatures. So now, rebirth is taken for granted in Tibetan cultures. This is the 13th Dalai Lama, and I'm using these slides to illustrate how the process of rebirth is recognized in certain lineages of tulkus, or so-called reincarnate lamas. Okay, so the 13th Dalai Lama surrounded by his attendants, his court, and then taking rebirth as a small child in Amdo in northeastern Tibet in 1934 in a simple farming village. I just love these photos. So I hope, I've been collecting them over many years, and I thought people might enjoy seeing the evolution of His Holiness over a lifetime. So cute, yeah? And as he grows up and he studies, here he is with his parents and his sisters, and then being enthroned in Lhasa as the Dalai Lama. So cute, so adorable. And then eventually taking responsibility for the government at the tender age of 16, having passed his Geshe exams, which are extremely demanding, in front of an audience of some 10,000 scholars and monks, which was pretty amazing, and passing with flying colors. Even traveling to Beijing with the Pension Lama on the left, and meeting, this is obviously a colorized photo, and meeting with Mao Zedong and trying to work out some kind of compromise solution to the question of Tibet's autonomy. He worked for 9 years trying to work out a solution, but in the end, Mao famously said that religion is poison, and His Holiness was, of course, became very worried. On the left, you'll see Zhou Enlai, who actually saved a lot of monasteries in China. His mother was a Buddhist. So in any case, His Holiness also went to India in 1956 for Buddha Jayanti, where he met Nehru, and also tried to explain the situation and get support. But unfortunately, it was his efforts were unsuccessful, and he was forced to flee in 1959 to the Tibetan border, a 17-day journey protected by Khampa warriors obviously from the east. And finally arriving at the Indian border and welcomed by the Indian government, for which we are all very grateful. Here's the guard who welcomed him at the border, and he recently reconnected with him. Yes, that was amazing. So he was featured on the cover of Time magazine and set about re-establishing every cultural institution of Tibet in exile. Now, the only case in anthropological journals of such a reconstitution of every single institution. Here he is with his entire family, mother, sisters, 4 brothers, and a remarkable family. Here he is with all of the great lamas who managed to escape from Tibet, and also Bakula Rinpoche from Ladakh on the right. A great contemplative, amazing scholar and consummate statesperson. Here he is on a March 10th celebration, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, the Congressional Medal of Honor, many honorary university degrees, engaging in interreligious dialogue with many different religious leaders. Here, Bishop Tutu is trying to teach him how to dance, but he doesn't quite get it. So in 1994, I invited him to Hawaii, and he blessed us with his presence for 4 days, also dialoguing with Hawaiian leaders, and he meets with political leaders. Now here's another case of a reincarnate Lama who unfortunately has disappeared. This is the Pension Lama that you saw earlier, but unfortunately he and his parents have both disappeared, and no one really knows what's become of them. But His Holiness remains a world leader. So now, why do I mention all of this? Just to illustrate this tradition of recognizing the continuity of consciousness over many lifetimes. In the case of great practitioners in the Tibetan tradition, unique among Buddhist traditions, they have a custom of recognizing these the rebirth of great lamas. Now, I'd like to also instantiate the Tibetan cultural practices as they continue in border areas in India. Here, I'm not sure if you can see up in this area. I'm going to take you to Zanskar, but there are many Buddhist areas along the border here of India and up in Arunachal Pradesh, Mentawang, and so forth, that fell in Indian territory when the British drew the McMahon Line in 1904. Turned out to be rather fortunate for those who became Indian citizens. The terrain is very similar, including all of the precarity of the ecosystem. Even to move a stick or a rock in a village in Zanskar requires the agreement of the entire village. Now, to get into Zanskar, although it looks completely like a Tibetan region, we travel for one day to Muslim areas and where the people speak a language similar to Tibetan, though they're Muslim. And you'll see that the landscape and the architecture resembles Tibet very closely, the language and so on. The monasteries, very remote monasteries, again, the precarity of the water sources. Even to take a bucket of water from one village to another, one needs to get permission. And this is how they have maintained the ecosystem until today, this very precarious landscape. The people in these areas revere His Holiness as their spiritual leader. They say, we are His people. They have special traditions that resemble Tibetan traditions and are also quite unique. The pera, the jewelry that women wear and pass on to their daughters through generations. Now, the archetypal meditation on death and dying in the Tibetan tradition in all the Himalayan areas is death is definite, but the time of death is indefinite. And at the time of death, only our spiritual practice will be of any benefit at all. Actually, the original says Dharma practice, but I like to broaden it a bit to include people of all religious backgrounds or perhaps no religious background at all. Because for all of us, death is definite. The time of death is indefinite. And at the time of death, only our spiritual practice, our karma, our meditation practice, and so on will be of any benefit. So they meditate on this. Now here is, these are photos of the funeral of an aristocratic woman in Leh, in Ladakh, which is sort of the gateway to Zanskar. And you can see some of the traditions that they follow in performing a very elaborate funeral ritual because of her social status. And the people will attended by the hundreds. She was very well respected. And the preparations, the monks are all assembled to recite prayers and say mantras and recite texts and so on, and dedicate the merit to her, all the ritual implements and so on. Now this is Yama, the Lord of Death, who is said to be waiting to pounce on us at any moment, right? And he holds the wheel of life in his fangs. So rather terrifying image. Here is a portrayal, Tibetan portrayal of meditation on death and the corpse at the time of death, and how, in the end, our bodies are, if we don't cremate them, then they decompose and are eaten by worms and other living creatures. Now, Tibet is in a unique position because of its altitude, and it has many different ecosystems, actually, not just one. But snow mountains are one that we often hear about. Now, at the time of death, it's not impossible that some very frightening images would appear to our mind. So one practice, in addition to this meditation on death is definite, but the time of death is indefinite, is to meditate on positive images of awakening, such as images of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And this is an image of White Tara. White Tara is also the embodiment of long life, so that, she can help practitioners to live a long life. Now, if you're a practitioner, you want a long life because you want to do as much spiritual practice as you can before you die and be well prepared for that eventuality. If, on the other hand, you're engaging in misdeeds, especially killing, well, maybe short life is okay. So here are images of the charnel ground and the sky burial from early on, a painting. And here is an actual practice of a Rogyapa who is attending to a sky burial of someone who is recently deceased. So according to this ritual, they would chop the body and mix the flesh with sampa, roasted barley flour, and offer it as a last act of generosity to the birds and wild animals. In the case of highly realized practitioners, often there are relics that are found after the body is cremated. If the body is cremated, which is usually the case with highly realized practitioners, they'll find different kinds of relics, all different kinds. Some looking like gemstones, some looking like bones, some looking like tortoise shell and other materials. In some cases, the body simply does not decompose. And this is an example from an area called Spiti, which is about, this particular village is just about 3 kilometers from Tibet, but it falls on the Indian side of the border. A practitioner passed away about 600 years ago and was buried in a stupa, a reliquary, and was revered in song in the village. But only when an earthquake occurred in the village and the stupa broke open did they find the practitioner still sitting there. His hair looks as if it's still growing. And in his hands, he had some prayer beads, a mala, and he appeared to be turning the beads. So when the air hit the body, it started to shrivel, to dry up a bit. Otherwise, it looked completely lifelike. And when the Indian Archaeological Society carbon dated the body, they found that it was indeed around 600 years old. There's another case up in Buryatia of a Lama who passed away in the 1920s and 30s, around that time. And his body also did not decompose. It was kept even throughout the Soviet era. They somehow managed to preserve the body. And it's shown once a year, but I was fortunate to be able to see it. And this is the power of one's spiritual attainments, they say. Now, I'd like to explain a little bit about the process of birth after the intermediate state and leading to birth in another body. The Tibetans have a very highly evolved system of embryology, and it's illustrated in many texts and tankas. And you'll see that the process of re-existence, rebirth or re-existence, because of course we don't get reborn immediately. We're usually in the womb for 9 or 10 months. So here up on the upper left-hand side, you'll see a couple in union and portrayed as a human being, a fully grown human being, but actually it's the consciousness of an incipient being, a Gandharva, or who is ready to take rebirth. And attracted by the heat of the couple mating, then the being will enter the body. It's said that if the being will be male, he is attracted to the mother. If he will be female, he's attracted to the father. Very Freudian sort of idea. And here's a close-up, not so clear, but just to give you an idea. And it's all framed within the Buddhist context. Yeah. So here's another example. Taking re-existence. Okay, now I mentioned that the elements of the body dissolve. And this is rather elaborate. We don't have the time to go into it in detail, but just to illustrate that it's all merged, the philosophy and the practice are merged together here. The 5 aggregates dissolve one by one, and as each aggregate dissolves, it's associated with one of the 5 basic wisdoms. The first four are also associated with the four elements, right? And some put ether as the fifth element associated with consciousness. These are associated with the six sources or sense spaces, we can call them, the eye sense space, ear sense space, nose sense space, and so on, and certain objects of those senses. So as the aggregates dissolve, these five basic wisdoms arise, the four constituents of the body dissolve, and the four sources lose their power. The four sense powers lose their power, literally. Okay, so we go into a bit of detail, and just stop me when we need to stop. Take, for example, the form element associated with the earth element, form aggregate, associated with the earth element and the faculty of vision. Now, when this is the first one to dissolve, the body weakens and feels heavy. We have difficulty opening and closing our eyes. Our vision dims and the physical world appears unclear. The mind becomes confused and we become prone to emotional outbursts, depression, and so on. A mental image or internal appearance arises like a silver blue mirage. Second, the feeling aggregate dissolves. This is associated with the dissolution of the water element and the faculty of hearing. Our bodily fluids dry out. We sweat and feel cold after. We lose our hearing, our sense of hearing. We no longer feel pain or pleasure. Our mind becomes hazy, nervous, irritable, and an internal appearance arises of a blue-gray smoke. This is what Lama was explaining when I burst into the Library of Tibetan Archives in 1972. And the third aggregate of discriminations associated with the fire element, the faculty of smell. In this case, as the fire element dissolves, our body begins to feel cold. Our sense of smell diminishes. Our digestion fails. It's the fire element that digests our food, right? Our respiration becomes difficult. The mind is alternately clear and unclear. We can hardly recognize anything. And internally, we see a vision of sparks like an outdoor flame or fireflies. Next, the mental formations begin to decline, to dissolve. These are associated with the wind element and the faculty of taste. Our respiration becomes difficult. Here's where the rattle, that health practitioners are aware of, the rattle occurs. Our exhalation and inhalation are disrupted. Eye movement slows down. We no longer recognize our loved ones. Visions arise according to tendencies. These are the visions that I mentioned, either terrifying visions or hopefully loving, soothing, positive images of awakening, such as Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And the internal image or appearance is a sputtering flame. So at this point, the 80 conceptions of the ordinary mind dissolve one by one. 33 thought states, 40 more subtle thought states, 7 diluted thought states. And there arises an internal vision like a red, steady flame. Then a radiant white sky, and a white drop descends from the crown of our head to our heart. So this is called the mind of radiant white appearance. It's the dissolution of the subtle mind. A red drop at the base of our spine moves up to our heart. Internally, we see a radiant red sky. And the subtle mind of radiant white appearance may be seen as a brief white flash. The mind of radiant red increase may be seen as a brief red flash. So the length depends on the extent of our spiritual awareness, our practice. Now, two further practices that I should mention. This meditation on the transition from life to death is one very popular practice, very common practice. Another is the practice of chit, or cutting through appearances, using thigh bone horns and small drums with many different, oh, wow, the mind of red appearance. Oh, okay, is practiced throughout the Himalayan region in India, Nepal, Tibet, Mongolia, Russia, and large parts of China today. Yep. So here you'll see the monks usually practicing with a large drum. And in this practice, we actually meditate or visualize giving away our body parts to whoever needs them. After all, when we die, we no longer need our bodies, but cut through our attachment to self, our self-obsession. We practice literally offering in generosity our body parts, our eyes, our organs, whatever people need or want. So all through the Mongolian regions, Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, and up into the Russian Buddhist areas. You see this practice is very popular. Another very popular practice is phowa, where we meditate on assembling the 72,000 winds of the body in the various channels and gathering them into the right, left, and central psychic channel, then directing those winds up to the Ushni, to the very top of our head, that soft spot at the top of our head, but no further until the moment of death. It's just a rehearsal, dry run, but we don't eject the consciousness until the moment of death, right? And this is a practice of wishing to be born in the Pure Land of Amitabha. Rebirth in a Pure Land makes it very easy to achieve perfect awakening. So because the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are teaching 24/7 and there's no distractions and people can practice intensively so they can achieve awakening quickly. So this is an introduction to precarity in the Tibetan tradition. And we return to the theme that all of our lives are precarious, especially now, perhaps more than ever before. So perhaps these practices, these teachings have more relevance now than any time in the past. And we can benefit from them. We can access them. We can access them in English. We still have teachers who know and can explain them. And so now I would welcome your questions, if you have questions, and I will.
I'd just like to close tonight by thanking our speaker, Professor Lekshe Tsomo, who joined us virtually. And despite technical problems, we overcame and were treated to a wonderful lecture and some great photographs. Thank you for sharing those with us as well, the results of long time collecting. I would also like to thank our departmental home, the Department of Asian Studies, staff at Asian Studies, William Strausser, Michelle Strauss, who assist with program events. I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for coming out tonight. You make our events possible. I would like to thank our donor, the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation, for their general sponsorship of the study of Buddhism at UBC and public events like tonight. And our last note, I'd love to turn things over to Dagmar Schwerk, who will announce Professor Tsomo's next talk.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, we are running out of time and I don't want to take too much time, but if you would like to join us for the pleasure of having Professor Lekshe Tsomo a second time here already on next Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so 9 p.m. Eastern Time, to inaugurate the first UBC Himalaya Program annual lecture with her, you are very much welcome. We will talk, or Professor Tsomo will talk about gender and Himalayan Buddhism, glacial shifts in attitudes. And just a short note about this new annual lecture we will inaugurate with her as the first speaker. We will create an interdisciplinary inclusive node for Himalayan studies in Canada by drawing together faculty, students, and community members from across UBC and the Lower Mainlands. And this will kind of provide a platform for exchange. And of course, this year we are still online, but of course we are hoping in the next year that this will be in person. And we could also win Professor Tsomo for visiting 2 classes this year online and having a discussion with our grad students. So we are very happy for that. And in the future, hopefully, we'll also have in-person workshops. So it would be really great if you would join us on Monday. I would be happy to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Yeah, good night.